Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Allison Fitzgerald Kojak, and I am the Washington Investigations Editor at the Associated Press and the 112th President of the National Press Club. And we have a little AP team here, yay! Thank you all so much for joining us on this lovely evening in our beautiful club. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, and this is one of our most important nights of the year, because this is the night that we recognize an outstanding journalist with our highest honor, the Fourth Estate Award. Now, before we begin everything, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the passing today of Congressman Elijah Cummings. We were honored this summer at the National Press Club to have had Chairman Cummings visit here and give a speech. He was in a wheelchair, but he insisted on standing for his speech, and his rich baritone voice, which many of you are familiar with, was as strong as ever. He was always clear. What was always clear about Congressman Cummings is that he loved the city of Baltimore. He cared about his constituents, and he worked hard to defend his city, this country, and the institution of Congress that he loved so much. I think we all can agree in this room that he will be sorely missed. The Fourth Estate Award tradition dates back to 1973, when our first honoree was Walter Cronkite of CBS News. Over the years, we've had the distinct privilege to honor Fourth Estate winners, including Bob Woodward, Christiane Amanpour, Gwen Ifill, Andrea Mitchell, and last year's doubleheader, Washington Post executive editor Marty Baron, and his counterpart at the New York Times, Dean Baquet. I'd like to give a special welcome to previous Fourth Estate winners who are here tonight, including Paul Steiger and Jim Lehrer. This year's recipient is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, the author of multiple books, and the leader of a string of successful newsrooms, Amanda Bennett. Amanda is currently the director of Voice of America, and truly someone so many of us here at the club admire for her commitment to top-notch journalism and to mentoring and empowering other journalists to do their best work. We're all looking forward to sharing more about this fabulous honoree later in the evening. But I just want to mention that this evening is also a fundraiser. We might say that a few times tonight. It's a fundraiser for the National Press Club Journalism Institute, which is our nonprofit affiliate that advocates for press freedom worldwide. And I think we all know we need that right now. It also puts on seminars, trainings, and discussions to help journalists learn more and do better work. And the Institute provides scholarships for budding high school and college journalists. I'm going to take a moment to introduce you to our head table tonight, starting from my far right. We have Sandy Rowe. She's a former editor of The Oregonian, a former chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists, former president of ASNE, and most importantly, she's a friend of Amanda Bennett. We have Mackenzie Mays, a reporter for Politico and a former investigative reporter at the Fresno Bee. You might recognize Don Graham, the former publisher of the Washington Post and the proud husband of tonight's honoree. To my immediate right is Barbara Cochran, president of the board of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. To my left is Amanda Bennett, tonight's Fourth Estate honoree. And Julie Brown, the investigative reporter for the Miami Herald. Next to Julie is Michael Sallah, Senior Investigations and Projects Editor at Buzzfeed News. And finally, to my far left, we have John Donnelly, CQ Roll Call Senior Writer and the Chairman of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Team. There are several past presidents of the National Press Club here who've stood at this podium before. Would all of you please stand for a moment? Be recognized. Thank you. Look at them. I'd also like to acknowledge our National Press Club Board of Governors, the Board of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and the Fourth Estate Awards Selection Committee and Dinner Committee, which was led by Rob Stoddard. Could you all please stand for a moment? So, as I mentioned earlier, tonight's a benefit for the NPC Journalism Institute, and to make it easy for you to give, we've set up a text-to-give option. Just text the words, Fourth Estate, that's number fourth estate, 19, to the number 44321. You'll get a link where you can make a donation. You follow the link and follow the instructions, or because we like to offer variety here at the National Press Club, we've also placed some envelopes on your tables. So I'll thank you in advance for your generosity. Now, it's my great pleasure to bring Barbara Cochran, President of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, to the podium to talk about this year's John Uberchaun Award winners. The award is named after former Press Club President John Uberchaun, and it honors journalists who, quote, embody the struggle to advance press freedom and open government. Barbara?
Thank you, Allison, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. As Allison just said, this is a very important night for the National Press Club and the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and we're just thrilled that you're here to share it with us. We're going to honor some outstanding journalists. We're going to pay tribute to courageous fighters for press freedom, and we're going to congratulate the student journalists who are our hope for the future. Tonight, we want to shine a light on one overriding theme, and let me say it as strongly as I can. Journalism is an essential pillar of our democracy. You can applaud. Journalism is not fake news. Journalists are not the enemies of the people. And in fact, to quote our very first Fourth Estate Award winner, Walter Cronkite, journalism is what we need to make democracy work. That is why throughout the year, the Institute works as hard as possible to support independent, truthful journalism. In doing so, we are also contributing to a healthy, thriving civil society. We empower journalists to do their best work through our professional development programming. We defend journalists from harassment, obstruction, and worse through our press freedom efforts. And through our awards, like those tonight, we honor the tremendous work journalists do to make sure that citizens get the information they need to govern themselves. We promote democracy and a civil society by convening journalists and public officials for candid conversation about how we can work together to serve those citizens. And we prepare a path for future journalists with our scholarship programs. So right now, I'd like to introduce you to one of this year's scholarship winners. She is Edna Rutland. She just graduated from Central High School in Macon, Georgia, and she's using her scholarship. Some folks from Macon in the house. This is great. She's using her scholarship to study journalism at Florida A&M. She received the Julie Shue Scholarship for Diversity in Journalism, which will provide $5,000 each year for 4 years. The scholarship is named in the memory of the longtime executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the beloved Julie Hsu, who passed away just last year. Edna came to the press club in August. She's in school now, that's why she can't be here with us. She came in August to receive her scholarship in person. So let's take a look at this video of her remarks.
I just wanted to say thank you to my family, to my city, and just to everybody who made it possible for me to be up here. We live in a world that a lot of times likes to tell kids that look like me or kids who are from where I'm from that you can't do anything, that you won't be great, that you can't be amazing. So for an organization like the National Press Club to read my application and to say that I was worthy of greatness and of wonderful things, that's amazing, really. So I just want to say thank you, because so often, you hear no, and all it takes is that one yes. So I guess today was my one yes. Thank y'all.
And as Edna said, that yes is so important. You too can say yes to future journalists like Edna with the donation to the Journalism Institute. You can give right now, as Allison explained, by texting the number 4, the state, 19 to 44321. Or you can take home one of the envelopes on your table and give later. Whatever way you decide to do it, we thank you very much for your support. And now it's time to present this year's Audition Awards, named for John Uberchaun, a former president of the National Press Club who was himself a tireless fighter for press freedom. Each year, the club gives its Uberchaun Award to one journalist from the United States and one from overseas, who both have bravely pushed to disclose the truth under trying circumstances. One of those Uberchaun winners is here with us tonight, and I would like to ask Jason Rezaian, a past recipient, to please stand. Jason is now the global opinions writer for the Washington Post, and we are so happy to see you here tonight, Jason. And I would also like to acknowledge Yuna Lee, who was captured in North Korea and held for 14 months before she was released, thanks to the efforts of President Clinton. She now is working for Amanda at the Voice of America. Yuna, will you please stand and let us say how happy we are to have you with us. The international award this year goes to Aasif Sultan, a journalist with the Kashmir Narrator monthly magazine. Aasif Sultan was imprisoned last August and is accused of aiding insurgents, even though all he did was to report on them. Before he was in prison, police seized his electronic devices and notebooks. They interrogated him about his sources, and they tried to get him to become an informant. Sultan's case reflects the worsening conditions for the press and citizenry in Kashmir, which is, you probably all know, a region in northern India where control is divided between India and Pakistan. The Indian-controlled section has been semi-autonomous for decades, but the current Indian government moved to bring the region fully under its control. It instituted a crackdown that left journalists struggling to report the news. Many have been incarcerated or beaten. Here to receive the award on behalf of Aasif Sultan is John Donnelly, senior writer for Congressional Quarterly Roll Call, president of Military Reporters and Editors, and chair of the National Press Club Press Freedom Team. Please welcome John.
Thank you, Barbara. It is an honor to receive this award on behalf of Asif Sultan and his family. We chose Asif Sultan to receive an Uberchaun Award this year because his situation is so unjust and dire, and because his case reflects a crisis in the Indian state of Kashmir for journalists and for all citizens there. Barbara told you a little bit about what's happening there in Kashmir. Largely as a result of that crackdown, it was not practical for any of Asif's family members to come here and receive the award, but we're grateful and lucky that Asif's brother Omar, who teaches in Saudi Arabia, was able to send us a video message on this occasion.
My name is Sultan, brother of Aasif Sultan, who is awarded with John Uberchaun Press Freedom Award by the National Press Club. I, on behalf of my brother Aasif Sultan, as jail journalist, I'm thankful to the National Press Club for this award, as it's an honor and privilege. I also thank them on behalf of my father, who is highly thankful from the core of his heart. Actually, it all happened with publication of an article on a militant commander of Hizbul Mujahideen, Burhan Wani, in 2018. When the article was published, Asif started receiving threats and phone calls and emails talking about, revealing his source. And ultimately, he was accused of harboring militants. As a result of that, our family suffered, and our parents suffered, and wife of Asif Sultan, and with a daughter who was at the time a toddler, and who is day in and day out looking for his dad. Unfortunately, with the recent clampdown that has happened 2 months before, apart from turning Kashmir into an open air prison, it is very difficult and dangerous time to be a journalist in Kashmir. And ultimately, one can understand, if this is the state of a journalist, what could be the condition of a common man. Thank you.
Thank you, Omer. Stories like Asif Sultan's unfold too regularly around the world in places like Tanzania, Iran, Turkey, China, Mexico. We at the Press Club and our Journalism Institute speak out as often as we can about these outrages. Here in the United States, we reporters, with a few rare exceptions, don't have to fear arrest, beatings, or murder for doing our jobs. But even here, the press is under siege as never before in recent memory, and the President of the United States leads the campaign. The problem was put in stark relief this month when the President's supporters produced a video that shows a fake President Trump gunning down reporters and others in a church. The President has said nothing to repudiate this filth. Indeed, he has encouraged the kind of people who made this video by his anti-press campaign, including nodding and winking at the idea of physically hurting reporters. And I want to emphasize that if a Democrat was spearheading such an assault on the First Amendment, I and my colleagues here would be speaking out against this just as forcefully. We saw 7 of our fellow reporters shot and 5 of them killed in the Capital Gazette newsroom in Annapolis last year. The shooter in that case was not motivated by the president's rhetoric per se, but at least 2 other men were found over the last year to have amassed arsenals, and they planned to use them on journalists. And they were stoked by Trump's rhetoric, and they said so in their writings. These 2 men were arrested before they could kill anyone. But when is someone like them going to succeed? Enough is enough. We should not assume that the worst cannot happen here. We have our Constitution, we have our traditions, but we are not impervious to history, nor are we immune to human nature. So please remember to be eternally vigilant, because we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for those important and inspiring words. And the reason I was so eager to get the picture is because we want to be able to send it to Asif's family, and maybe it'll get to him too somehow, someday. Our U.S. representative this year is Mackenzie Mays. She's now a Politico journalist, but she formerly reported for McClatchy's Fresno Bee in California. Mackenzie wrote stories for the Fresno Bee in 2017 and 2018 that angered powerful people. They lashed out at her, but she kept doing her job, which was holding authorities to account. In 2018, Mays wrote a story about alleged drug use and prostitution on a San Francisco Bay boat cruise sponsored by a winery that is partly owned by California Congressman Devin Nunes. The story did not state that Nunes was on the boat or knew about the cruise, and it noted that he did not respond to a request for comment. He never asked for a correction, and none was written. But after the story ran, Nunes sought to tar Mays and the Fresno Bee online, in broadcast ads, and with a 38-page mailer that assailed the paper and contained a photo of Mays. He also filed a defamation lawsuit against the paper. Likewise, in 2017, the Fresno school board chief didn't like a story Mays had written that quoted him. He called her, and this is a new word for me, the ministress of Mackenzie, of fake news, of propaganda, and Mackenzie Fake News Mays on social media. He put her phone number on Facebook and encouraged those who agreed with him to go to her house, all of which emboldened other social media trolls to verbally attack her and to make her worry about her security. Sadly, these kinds of attacks, which are becoming much more commonplace here in Washington, are now spreading beyond the Beltway. Mackenzie Mays represents the best of local journalism by keeping local officials accountable. Because she has persevered in the face of trolling, nuisance lawsuits, and implied and direct threats, we are proud to present her with the Uberchaun Press Freedom Award. Please welcome Mackenzie Mays.
Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here and to receive this and to even be amongst all of you. This is a dream come true, and it's especially hard to accept after hearing the story that we just heard about somebody being in prison for the work, which cyberbullying sounds pretty small in comparison, but I just wanted to say that I think what my newspaper at the time, the Fresno Bee, and I experienced in the past few years could have only happened now. Today, and I'm not going to try to diagnose why that is, but I can tell you that my editors, who I really admire, who've been doing the work for much longer than I have, had never experienced what we experienced there. And so we're all used to the politician-reporter relationship, right? We know that they might bristle when we write coverage that's critical of them, or they might even throw in an alleged, that was taken out of context. But this got a lot more ominous. And what really made the news was the congressman, but before that, actually, I think was worse. So at the time, I was the education reporter and the school board president of one of the biggest districts in the country, had made some homophobic comments to me in an interview about a sex ed mandate. And as soon as that story published, and as soon as there was public outrage about his comments, he came for me in a way that we had never seen. So I was the ministress of propaganda, that I had made the entire thing up. He went on TV and radio and compared me to a child sex predator because I was writing about sex ed. He said that what I had done was illegal. And there were troll accounts that found my brother on the internet and found out that he was gay and used that against me and said that I couldn't be a fair reporter because of that, so it involved my family too. And eventually he said politics is a full contact sport and that someone should come to my home on the weekend and teach me that, and I better wear a helmet. And that was when my editors and I finally decided to file a police report, and it got better after that. But then, Then, believe it or not, a congressman was upset. I changed from the education beat to the investigative beat, and I wrote about this lawsuit that he had ties to. And he took out TV ads that made it look like the Fresno Bee was his opposition, where he said we were fake news and told people in our small town to not believe anything that we wrote. And in the mailer, it had my photo at a press conference doing my job and my name saying that I wasn't real and that I should not be believed and that I shouldn't have a career. So while a lot of people noted that this was Trumpian, it's important to me to also say that it was sexist. A lot of the stuff that I experienced, I don't think I would have experienced, at least not at this level. So there's still an account out there that comments all the time about my appearance and my body and my image. And during the thick of this, someone told me that I should give up reporting and stick to making sandwiches. But I'm from West Virginia, and my first job was at the Charleston Gazette, which is now the Charleston Gazette-Mail. And they taught us that the mantra of journalism above all else should be sustained outrage. And I really took that to heart, and to me that means that I should keep reporting no matter the obstacles, and that I should make sure that people know as much as they can about the public officials that they've elected, about the organizations that we're supposed to hold accountable. And reporters in West Virginia feel a really genuine and sincere obligation to their readers and their communities, and I hope that I keep doing that. And that's what I tried to think about during all of this. People kept using the word badass and calling me a badass, which is a great compliment, but they didn't see who I'd really like to think what they saw, my editors at the Fresno Bee and my colleagues at the Fresno Bee, when I was crying in my editor's office more than once. And they were trying to take me out to margaritas to make me feel better about everything. So the people who say that I'm that didn't get to see everything behind closed doors, so I'm really thankful for them. And I'm also thankful for my Politico editors who are here tonight. They were not afraid to hire a troublemaker like me in the middle of all of this, and they push us to be disruptors. And so, yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Wow. That's tremendous. These kinds of threats that Mackenzie faced and Aasif Sultan have faced, as John pointed out, are very serious because they can turn into something that leads to physical harm and even death. John talked about last year we presented a special Press Freedom Award to Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist for the Washington Post who was brutally murdered in Turkey, and we just passed the 1-year anniversary of his really assassination. And we also honored the 5 staff members of the Capitol Gazette and their 2 colleagues who were wounded. They were killed by a gunman who stormed into their Annapolis newsroom. They were journalists and staff members who served their community. They were beloved by their colleagues, and yet even in their office, they were not safe. It was the deadliest assault against journalists in U.S. history. Think about that. Every year, journalists like them give their lives to bring truthful information to their readers, listeners, and viewers. But here in Washington, D.C., which is home to so many monuments to our nation's leaders and to significant events in our history, there is no federal memorial to journalists who have died in service to democracy. That lack of recognition of the value and sacrifice of journalists must be addressed. And that is why, thank you, let's applaud that. And that is why the National Press Club Journalism Institute is so proud to serve as the home for the newly created Fallen Journalists Memorial Foundation. Now, getting a monument built in Washington is no easy task. It takes quite literally an act of Congress. We are thrilled that bipartisan and I stress bipartisan legislation, has been introduced in the House and Senate, and we look forward to its passage soon so that we can get to work with the National Park Service and other agencies to build this memorial. And I'm especially delighted to say that tonight's Fourth Estate honoree, Amanda Bennett, serves on the Board of Advisors of the Fallen Journalists Memorial Foundation, along with her husband, Donald Graham, and with our National Press Club president, Allison Kojak, and some of our guests here tonight, including Jim Lehrer and Al Hunt. Thank you to them and to the members of the Press Club and Journalism Institute boards for their support of this important project. It is exactly the kind of work the Institute must do to ensure that journalism is valued, appreciated, and celebrated as a pillar of democracy. Thank you for listening, and now I'll turn the podium back over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I promise we'll all be able to eat dinner soon. We are so proud of the work done by the National Press Club Journalism Institute, which, together with the Press Club, strives to eliminate barriers to press freedom in the U.S. and abroad. So I'm going to take a moment tonight to thank our sponsors who made all that work possible. They are Al Jazeera Media Network, the NCTA, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Toyota, CNN, the Craig Newmark Foundation, Syngenta, Andrea and Michael Edney, the Associated Press, Brown Capital, Barbara and John Cochran. Thank you all for your generosity. So much of what we do here would not be possible without the generosity of our sponsors and donors, and I want to make clear our work is more important than ever. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the major efforts your contributions would help tonight. How many people in this room know who Austin Tice is? Hey, thank you. If you raised your hand or nodded quietly, it might be because of the hard work right here at the National Press Club and the Journalism Institute. It was last year that we at the club teamed up with Austin Tice's parents and launched a major campaign to raise awareness about Austin's situation. And if you didn't raise your hand, I'm going to tell you a little bit. Austin is a freelance journalist, a former Marine, a graduate of Georgetown University, a Texan, and 7 years ago, he was captured in Syria and has been held captive ever since. Austin is in great danger. We at the National Press Club and our Journalism Institute have made it our mission to see that Austin comes home safely. So for the first half of this year, we promoted Night Out for Austin Tice, in which nearly 100 restaurants last May across the entire country agreed to hold special events in Austin's name and give a portion of their profit to a fund that would help bring Austin home. After a successful night, which was attended by thousands of people, covered by news organizations all across the country, we didn't stop, we just kept going with a new campaign. It's called Ask About Austin. And just a few weeks ago, dozens of volunteers, including me and my 12-year-old little son, did just that. We went to Capitol Hill with Austin's parents, Mark and Deborah, and asked every member of Congress to support this young man. As a result, 173 members of Congress signed a bipartisan letter urging the president to keep Austin front and center in his foreign policy negotiations. We're going to continue working with the Tices for Austin's release, and you can help by supporting the Institute, by texting or looking at that envelope on your table, but just know that these are the kinds of efforts that your donations would go to. And now, please enjoy your dinner.
Thank you, everybody. Welcome back. We are now going to present two more awards, the Sheehan Award and the Fourth Estate Award. For the second year, we are presenting an award that recognizes outstanding investigative reporting. The Neil and Susan Sheehan Prize for Investigative Reporting is named for the legendary New York Times reporter and his wife, Susan, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and staff writer at The New Yorker. Two very generous friends of the Sheehans, Ralph and Marianne Krause, created the award to honor the Sheehans and their extraordinary commitment to the principle that a vibrant democracy depends on an informed citizenry and a free press. We are so grateful to the Krauses for bringing this idea to us and to the Sheehans for allowing us to honor them in this way. And we're especially pleased to welcome tonight their daughter, Maria Sheehan. Maria, if you could stand and let us recognize you, please. The recipient of this year's 2019 Sheehan Prize is Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald. Julie Brown is renowned as an investigative reporter, and she's being honored tonight for her investigation of Jeffrey Epstein, the financier and convicted sex offender. Her work gave voice to Epstein's long-ignored victims and prompted a legal re-examination of Epstein's predatory behavior. She revealed a decade-old secret plea bargain that hid the scope and details of the accusations against Epstein and denied the young women he victimized their day in court. The Herald series, Perversion of Justice, led to a federal sex trafficking indictment against Epstein and the resignation of Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta for his role in the deal. We like to develop our journalism fans young. This is the kind of journalism that Neil and Susan Sheehan would wholeheartedly embrace, we think. Julie Brown's reporting has given voice to the voiceless, held the powerful accountable, and cracked the seals of government secrecy. And Julie is a fitting successor to last year's very first Sheehan Prize recipients, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey of the New York Times, for their groundbreaking reporting on Harvey Weinstein. Here to share more information about tonight's honoree is Michael Sallah, her one-time editor and now senior investigations and projects editor at Buzzfeed News. Please welcome Michael Sallah.
Okay, I'm honored to be here tonight to introduce my friend Julie Brown as she receives the Neil and Susan Sheehan Prize for Investigative Journalism. Julie's intrepid reporting on the Epstein story made those of us who know her, friends and colleagues, very proud. What would have been difficult for anyone in the country over the last year to have missed her work. In the age of Me Too, the Herald's Perversion of Justice series was among the most outrageous of stories. A wealthy Wall Street investor who preyed relentlessly on young women, and a secret plea deal by an ambitious prosecutor and well-connected defense lawyer that denied justice. For a while, it seemed like any given day we'd see Julie being interviewed on CBS This Morning or the Today Show or CNN's reliable sources, and of course she'd always let us know ahead of time. And she became one of the best-known reporters in the country. But to us, her colleagues, it really wasn't a surprise. Her passion, her profession, her sense of righteous indignation are really infectious. She hails from Philly, and trust me, if you've, yeah, and if you spend any time with her, you know it. I still remember when we started together a few months apart as team leaders at the Herald nearly 15 years ago. She was an enterprise editor, but titles are deceiving. At heart, she's a reporter. And from her shouts in the newsroom, "Are you effing kidding me?" or "This MFer is not handing over the records." Journalists are, shaped by what they learn, and whether it's from college or years of minding their beats. Julie's driven really by her own life experiences. Raised by a single mom, she and her two siblings knew what it was to struggle. She remembers the day she came home and the furniture was gone because of a bill that went unpaid. Sometimes she and her siblings were the targets of neighborhood bullies. At 16, after her mother remarried, she filed the paperwork in court to become legally emancipated. She wanted to be on her own, so she ended up living with friends, working, but never forgetting her roots. And she knew that education was really important, and that God knows she didn't want to work in a lampshade factory the rest of her life. So at 22, she received a scholarship to attend Temple, where she fell in love with journalism. At the Philadelphia Daily News and later the Miami Herald, she blazed her own trail. She covered every conceivable story, but much of her work seemed to be driven by coverage of the underdog, or she'll tell you the little guy. I still remember when the Herald was playing catch up on a biogenesis scandal, and the story was about Major League Baseball players accused of getting performance-enhancing drugs from a clinic near Miami. The Herald urged Julie to jump into the story, and no surprise, instead of following the pack, she identified, with the help of a whistleblower, the real victims of the story, teenagers. The same clinic that delivered human growth hormones to baseball greats like Alex Rodriguez had been injecting the drugs into the arms of high schoolers, and that bothered her. The story prompted the U.S. Attorney's Office to launch an investigation, and charges were eventually filed against the clinic owner. There were other stories: cops targeting homeless people to gin up arrests, police commanders failing to hold bad cops accountable. When prison officials said an inmate with severe mental disabilities died of accidental causes, Julie didn't buy it. So over this course of 2 years, she detailed beatings, sexual assaults, and other crimes within the Florida correction system by prison guards, and blatant efforts by their supervisors to cover up the crimes. There was a 50-year-old man with severe mental disabilities who died after he was thrown into a scalding makeshift shower after he defecated in a cell, and his skin was literally falling off from the torrents of hot water. So the stories were stunning, they were meticulously reported, and they led to the resignation of the state's top prison official and reform legislation to oppose greater oversight of the prison system. She won several awards for her work, including a George Polk, but I think what impressed us was the arrival of this giant greeting card, and it's signed by dozens of inmates, thanking, quote, Miss Julie Brown for being there when they didn't have anybody. And her next project would be much the same. The Jeffrey Epstein story had been out there for years. News organizations had covered the case of this rich guy who preyed on young girls. But as Julie said, something just wasn't right, even in the coverage. I'm sure she's going to tell you more about this and the challenges she and her colleague Emily Michaud faced in getting the story out. But once again, she found herself in familiar terrain. No one had ever questioned the girls, young victims, about how they were treated by the criminal justice system. I think that's really drove her. The results of the Miami Herald's work were remarkable, and finally, after more than a decade of the criminal case collecting dust in the archives of the courthouse, justice finally prevailed. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to introduce Miss Julie Brown.
Stop it, you're gonna make me cry. Thank you. So I had already been pretty familiar with Jeffrey Epstein in March 2017 when President Trump nominated Alexander Acosta to be Labor Secretary. I knew Acosta was the prosecutor who gave Epstein, this wealthy, politically connected money manager accused of molesting dozens and perhaps hundreds of underage girls, federal immunity as part of an extraordinarily unusual plea deal. The case was not a new story, and a lot of journalists had written about Epstein's deal over the past decade. Yet, as I watched his Senate confirmation hearing, I was surprised that lawmakers asked very few questions about the case, even though it was the most controversial of Acosta's career. The next day, it was barely mentioned in some of the stories that were written about his appointment. It was like it had slipped into a footnote of history. I wondered about the girls who were now women, where they were, what they thought about this former prosecutor now leading an agency that had oversight over child labor, human trafficking, and important protections for some of those most vulnerable in our country. My editor and I were skeptical that we would turn up anything new. I actually thought it was going to be more of a React story, get some quotes from some victims and that would be all. But finding his victims proved more challenging than I expected. Since they were all minors, they were listed as Jane Does in public and court documents. There was Jane Doe number 1, Jane Doe number 2, Jane Doe all the way up to 140. By that time, there was 10,000 pages of court documents that had been filed over the past decade. It took me months to find them. I was astonished to learn that there were far more victims than anyone had known about. As I began contacting them, I also learned that the women were still, after all these years, fighting for an elusive justice that even the passage of time had not made right. And I discovered that there was a lot more about this story that had never been told. The more I began digging, the more I realized that there were people, powerful people, who went to great lengths to keep the scope of this sex trafficking operation from becoming public. There were serious, concerted efforts to silence these women and seal countless documents so that no one would know the depth of this crime. As I began interviewing them, it became clear to me that these victims had been traumatized not just by Epstein, but by the forces in our criminal justice system that were supposed to protect them and hold the perpetrators who hurt them accountable. A thorough analysis of the case told an even more troubling story, that Epstein, bolstered by unlimited funds, not only manipulated the criminal justice system, but he used his web of influence and his elite social and political circle of friends to help him prey upon vulnerable girls and young women, even years after his plea bargain. Some stories are never really finished. Sometimes it's worth returning to them years later, looking at them as if they were cold cases and taking them apart in an effort to find answers. While this case continues to unfold and more influential people in his circle are implicated, I have been heartened by all the cards, letters, and emails from people around the world who have expressed their support for investigative journalism in ways big and small. This series of stories showed the world that journalists are not the enemy. Our job, which has never wavered, is to fight against the powerful, to bring truth to light in spite of the forces who want to hide those truths. Neil Sheehan, for whom this award is named, knows this better than anyone, having been the reporter who obtained the Pentagon Papers for the New York Times, facing powerful oppression against publishing the truth about the Vietnam War. As we know, it ultimately led to a landmark case on press freedom. I have always believed that it is the duty of the American journalist to seek out important truths and to get those truths to the public. Sheehan once said, "You are not an ally of the government. You are not a propagandist. You are not an advocate. You are a witness, and you've got to find out the truth." That's what an American journalist should do, because I think in this country, journalism is really a fourth branch of government. I want to thank Neil and Susan Sheehan for this great honor, the National Press Club, the National Press Club Institute, the Miami Herald, and our parent company, McClatchy, for supporting investigative journalism. Thank you.
And now it's time for tonight's fourth estate honoree, Amanda Bennett. Or, oh, yeah, go ahead. I just want to note that back when I worked at Bloomberg, we liked to call her Demanda. She's a stellar journalist, a celebrated editor, prize-winning investigative reporter, and the author of a whole bunch of books. She spent 23 years at the Wall Street Journal, which to some people would be a full journalism career. But when she left there, she was just getting started. Because Amanda is also a great leader. She created kick-ass investigative reporting teams in places where no such thing had existed, and she's one of a very few women who have led multiple newsrooms. She's really a pioneer among women in news. But what really makes Amanda remarkable is her generosity. She has been a teacher and mentor to me and to a long list of accomplished reporters who have their names on certificates and plaques and statues. And each of those awards should have Amanda's name on the back. Amanda Bennett is currently the director of the Voice of America, providing content in more than 45 languages to 237 million people each week. $237 million people on radio, television, mobile, and the internet. So she began her career at the Wall Street Journal, as I mentioned earlier, and she was honored with a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. She then moved to the Oregonian in Portland, which you'll hear about later. There, she created an investigative reporting team and then led that team to their own Pulitzer Prize in public service. Shortly thereafter, Knight Ridder stole her away, made her the editor of the Lexington Herald Leader, and then she was brought over to head their flagship newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer. We got some Philly fans here. After Philadelphia, she became an executive editor at Bloomberg News, where she created and ran a global team of investigative reporters and editors. And somewhere along the way, again, she found time to write all those books. So she's not only received a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, she served on the Pulitzer Committee, and many of the projects she led at Bloomberg have been honored with prizes including the Loeb Award, the Polk Award, and the Bartlett Steele Awards. I first crossed paths with Amanda when she came to Bloomberg to build the investigations team, and I wormed my way into a project on her team and then spent 4 years there. The crazy thing about her, and what makes her great, is that Amanda thinks big. She will lead her teams into these huge, unwieldy projects that seem impossible to pull off. A 7-part global series on food shortages across the world? No problem. A detailed look at the personal finances of the secretive leaders of China? Why not? And, oh yeah, why don't we sue the Fed? I was involved in a few of these, and just at the moment when it all seems impossible, when I would start to lose all hope, Amanda would turn up at my desk and look at me and smile and go, "Isn't this fun?" So I can't think of anyone I'd rather see honored with the Press Club's 4th Estate Award. And we're all going to learn a little bit more about Amanda if you look at the screen above my head.
One thing you have to know about Amanda is that, in simple terms, she got it.
She's tough.
You look at just what she's done.
She's fearless.
She's been sort of everywhere at every inflection point.
Top editor at a newspaper.
Bureau chief in Atlanta.
A Wall Street Journal reporter in China.
She's the first female editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer.
She has been part of 2 teams for Pulitzer Awards.
So the author of several books.
She clearly was one of the top journalists when I was interviewing people to be our next director of the Voice of America.
When I came here to be director of Voice of America, I knew that it was going to be a fun and interesting chapter in a long journalistic career.
Amanda worked in Detroit from 79 to 82. It was a tough place. Back then, it was sex appeal was supposed to sell cars. And we really want to get inside the show and do a story from the inside. Amanda understood that we were trying to tell people what was really happening, what things were really like. She got in the Ottawa paper for breaking down the gender barriers in the weightlifting business. But the really fun thing that she did was she worked out in this gym with all these sweaty, muscle-bound guys. And they thought, aha, we'll get rid of her. We'll tell her that there's no bathroom for the women. It's just for men. And she said, that's okay, I'll use this one.
We worked on the story about AIDS, which went on to win a Pulitzer Prize in 1997. And when the story came out, it had a profound impact because what we showed was that all of this funding was going to the wrong people.
Amanda came into the Oregonian as a change agent in 1998.
In the first couple of months, she began running 2 major projects, and one was the wonderful INS thing that won the Public Service Pulitzer.
There were 2 reporters who were both discovering real outrages about the way that at the time, the Immigration and Naturalization Service were treating people. She knew if this was happening in Portland, this must be happening elsewhere too.
Not long after Amanda became the editor of the Lexington Herald-Leader in Kentucky, we began to notice deaths due to the abuse of OxyContin. And it was the first American journalism, to my knowledge, that actually took data from the Drug Enforcement Administration and used it to determine that counties in rural Kentucky were getting more of the active ingredient in OxyContin than any other place in the United States.
2012. That was probably about the most exciting year to cover politics in China. There was a political drama. It involved murder. It involved spies. It involved defections. And we had settled on looking at the most controversial person of all, the next president of China, this guy named Xi Jinping. Once the Chinese government figured out what we were doing, they called Amanda and the editor-in-chief, Matt Winkler, into in a room in Washington and laid down the law and said, you will not publish this story. But Amanda stood her ground. We published the story on June 29th, 2012. And Amanda was getting married to Don the next day. We never would have known that because she was so calm about the whole thing, calm about the most controversial, the hardest-hitting political story ever to be written in China came out the day before she got married.
If you look at the range of subjects that we've taken on over the last 3 years under Amanda's tenure, poaching, China and Africa, the plight of the Rohingyas, press freedom.
The VOA did an amazing project this year about child marriage called The Worth of a Girl that included reporting from 12 different services in 12 different languages.
Deeper reporting, more extensive reporting, more ambitious reporting than we've ever done in VOA's history.
Our Voices broadcasts throughout the African continent, and it really gives a platform for women's issues. Amanda played a pivotal role in making this show happen.
Our mission is to provide objective, fact-based news and information to countries and places that don't have any other way to get it. So I feel like that we are part of the solution to this problem because what we're doing is broadcasting truth.
She's very passionate about journalism, and she feels that the way to really protect journalism is to protect the credibility of journalism.
Everyone talk about journalistic integrity, journalistic independence, but Amanda has really spent disproportionate of a time on those principles and really honed into the details that are from the principle to practices.
An interesting thing about Amanda is also she has a lot of information, she has a lot of education to share, but also she's an excellent listener. She listens to people.
She gets very, very close to whatever her projects are and makes everybody, I think, come along and sees her as a leader who they can follow because she's doing it in the field, not just from her office.
Imagine working an important story and you look up and you see the boss. I never once saw a CEO from MSNBC, Fox News Channel, or CNN travel to really see what the story is so that he or she could best spearhead the reporting. And that's what's different.
I think that speaks to who she is as a world-class journalist.
I know. The other wonderful thing about Amanda is all this adulation makes her very uncomfortable because she is humble. And I think we can all be glad after watching that video that her reach is now global. I'd now like to welcome up here to the podium Sandy Rowe, the former editor of The Oregonian, who is a good friend of Amanda Bennett. And like, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Allison. Thank you, everyone. It's going to be tough to follow that video, but I'm going to try. As you can see very well, it spotlights the amazingly broad sweep of excellence that Amanda Bennett has inspired and delivered, whether she's in Beijing or Detroit or Atlanta or Lexington, Kentucky, Tim Kelly, or Portland, Oregon. There are a few great editors who were essentially born in a national newsroom and spend their whole careers there. Yes, Lynn Downey, I'm thinking of you. There are many other great editors who hopscotch the East Coast a little bit. Maybe they'll have a stop at one regional shop. But I know of no one, as Allison said, who has guided more groundbreaking stories at such an incredibly high level of execution in such a range of newsrooms. As John Lansing said at the end of the video, she's world class. I first heard about Amanda in 1998 from my dear friend John Carroll. I cold called her, and after a single conversation, I was certain that I just had to hire her. It was obvious that she had a very refined sense of story, that she understood the demands of excellence, that she took the work very seriously, but herself not at all. We laughed, we chatted, and in that one conversation, I really thought I would die if I couldn't lure her to Oregon. Now, the Oregonian then wasn't necessarily an easy sell to a national editor. At the time, as you heard, Amanda had been editor of the Wall Street Journal for 23 years. She was the Atlanta bureau chief. She wasn't looking for a job. She had won a Pulitzer Prize and written or co-written 4 books. We were way out there at the extreme edge of the left coast, as far away from the power corridor as you can get. A regional newspaper that only recently was being recognized for excellence. And the timing wasn't good. She and husband Terry were days away from traveling to China to bring daughter Georgia back home to Atlanta. Yes, Georgia. This was hardly a job choice that her similarly situated colleagues would have made. Oh, sure, bring a daughter home from China, take her to Atlanta, move right away across country. But more than anyone I have ever known, Amanda's a risk taker, and she is a champ at clustering her stresses. Just amazing. She said yes, and I was elated, of course. She came to the Oregonian fully prepared and committed to help us become the best regional newspaper in the country. Amanda, you see, elevates everything she touches. She is hardwired to zero in on the best imaginable version of her reporters' skill sets and their stories, to reflect their best back to them, and to make a grand vision seem not just possible, but eminently doable. She makes believers of us all. So along with a formidable intellect, ironclad integrity, and her off-the-charts chops as a coach and editor, Amanda's big-hearted approach and good-natured cajoling made reporters want to work for her. Brent Walth remembers Amanda, one foot perpetually tucked underneath her when she sits in her chair, and when she got excited about a new detail that Brent would bring her, or another reporter, she'd bounce. And what Brent told me is, if I got her to bounce, it was a good day. For the INS project that won the Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal, Amanda gathered a disparate group of reporters, found a way to magnify their individual skills, and elevated what had started as an amorphous regional story into a nationwide portrait of misconduct and incompetence. She did this all without using a single anonymous source. Amanda coined the term prosecutorial editing and brought it into our newsroom, rigorously questioning and challenging the underlying assumptions of a story, proving and reproving every assertion of fact, repeatedly. Rather than bristle, our reporters never, ever felt more supported as when they worked with Amanda. As we all know, daily journalism can tend to avoid risk and encourage people to follow well-trod paths. But Amanda revels in taking a slightly different, more interesting path. She is fearless in challenging assumptions. She is always in service of the very best story possible. Along the way, Amanda creates no drama. She employs no look-at-me arm waving. She diminishes no one or their contribution. Amanda Bennett, you see, is in the business of making people better, and she treats every day in a newsroom as a chance for discovery and joy, both personal and professional. She makes the hardest work a pleasure. And in Oregon, when the rest of us would go home and collapse from weariness, Amanda would go home from work, and she was likely to unwind by initiating either a snowball or a paintball fight, weather dependent, with the kids in the neighborhood, or to dream up some other mini adventure for Georgia and Terry. In the winter of 2000, with publication of the INS series in sight and literally just several weeks away, husband Terry was hospitalized with one serious surgery, then a cancer diagnosis, then a second surgery. Amanda, keenly aware of coworkers' challenges, but rarely revealing her own, didn't tell her team and wouldn't let those of us who knew tell her team. Because with Amanda, you see, it is always about the work and the reporters on the line. It is never about her. She didn't want them worried about her while they were already under maximum stress. Those of us who knew this situation tried our best to push her out of the door, but if she went home or to the hospital earlier than normal, Terry, who was the ultimate cheerleader for Amanda, would push in the opposite direction, sometimes threatening not to take his medication if she didn't go back to work. Finally, a day or two before publication, our executive editor claimed page-proof duty. "Just go," he said, and kicked her out of the office. She did, But as she left, she passed the door of another editor and stuck her head in and asked that editor to please send another set of page proofs to the hospital so she could read them at bedside. I realized later I'd been watching a marathoner in the last mile, one of those reporters told me. That project wouldn't have happened without Amanda's ability to reach down and find some reserve to hit the wall and keep going. Even today, almost 2 decades later, when I talk to reporters about their time with Amanda, they uniformly cite it as the best, most challenging, most rewarding time of their careers. Luminous years, said one, for which I will always be grateful. Now, Amanda never acts like she thinks she's world class, but she is, and she always has been. She lifts all of us fortunate enough to be in her orbit. What I said about Amanda laser focusing on the best possible version of reporters' stories and talents, she also does with those she loves. Amanda sees you as better than you are, and she helps you believe in yourself. I and many others in this room are the beneficiaries of that. Thank you. Yes, we are. World class as a journalist, world class as a leader, and most especially as a friend. Thank you, Amanda. Love you.
We're going to welcome Dom Graham, Amanda's husband.
So agreeing to make this speech to all of you about my wife may confirm what several of my high school coaches used to say about me, more guts than brains. But here goes. My mother, Katharine Graham, was a historic figure in American journalism, the first woman publisher of one of America's largest newspapers, and for a time, the only woman CEO of any Fortune 500 company, 499 guys and her. If my mother could still be here tonight, and I dearly wish she could, she would say what she often said in later years, that women executives today have it much harder than she did as the inheritor of a family newspaper company. She noted, today's women have to make their way in the face of prejudice against them by men. They did much of their work while being wives and mothers of young children. I have a question for the journalists in this room. Who is the Katharine Graham of newspaper editors? Who was the first editor of a large metro in the United States? You just heard from her. Sandy Rowe became the editor of the Norfolk Virginian Pilot in 1984, quite a few years before she moved to the Oregonian. There she played this crucial role in Amanda's career, and Amanda went on to become the first woman editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, part of a generation of women editors on large papers, including Anne-Marie Lipinski, who wishes she could be here tonight, Janet Weaver, Julia Wallace, Susan Goldberg, who is here tonight, and others. I want to tell you that today, the top 3 editors at VOA, Amanda Bennett, Sandy Sugawara, and Uberchaun, make up the only all-women team leading a large newsroom in the United States. And tonight, though many distinguished women journalists have won this award, Amanda Bennett becomes the first woman to win this award for her work as an editor, the previous winners having been Helen Thomas, Mary McGrory, great writers, great columnists, and great broadcasters, but Amanda being the first editor. Amanda and I first met on the Pulitzer board, the board that awards the Pulitzer Prizes. And at our wedding reception, my son Will said that this proved the Pulitzer Board was better than OK Cupid. But we really did not get to know each other at all until we went out on a date sometime in 2008. Now, this was Amanda Bennett's life at that time. She lived in Philadelphia because she had promised her family that after moving there from Lexington, from Portland, from Atlanta, from New York, they wouldn't move again. She had an incredibly demanding job in New York at Bloomberg News, as Allison mentioned, where she was executive editor in charge of a great worldwide investigative team. So she got the 5 a.m. train from Philadelphia into New York every day, coming home for dinner with her children, and then often going back to work online. In the year after the death of her late husband, Terry Foley, a crucial figure in her career, both of Amanda's children asked to change schools. Her daughter, Georgia, moved to attend high school, living with Amanda's sister, Alex, in Pennington, New Jersey, so Amanda then spent many nights and weekends there. She worked in a few dates with me into this life. About our marriage, I can only confirm what her glorious cousin, Miles Lindahl, actually once said in print, quote, "Who wouldn't want to be married to Amanda?" When we got married, she moved to Washington but continued to work at Bloomberg much of the time in New York. She would take the 5 a.m. Sallah, and I bet most of you didn't know there was one, or the 6 a.m. shuttle, continuing to run her worldwide team. Not content with this level of activity, she also wrote a book. So the first thing I want to tell you about Amanda is that she has a highly unusual amount of energy. The second thing is that when she accepted John Lansing's offer to become the director of the Voice of America, she poured all that energy into leading what I have come to know as a great news organization. In her first week on the job, she learned that VOA had been a somewhat formal organization. At that start, in meetings, people called her Director Bennett. I still do at home. But at VOA, she did what came naturally to her. She started visiting newsrooms, treating journalists as colleagues in the way all great editors do. There are more than 40 such places at VOA, since each language service has its own newsroom. Amanda began bringing home colleagues from VOA and began telling me their stories. She told me about Ngusi Mengesha, who is here tonight, the director of VOA's African service, an exile from his native Ethiopia from 30 years who came to the US from a refugee camp in East Sudan. He got his first job at VOA and was never permitted to return to Ethiopia until Ethiopia's great new president invited him back this year and gave VOA his first interview. She told me about Miroslava Gongadze, the head of VOA's Ukrainian service, who came to work there after her journalist husband was murdered in Ukraine by police on official orders, and she heard a tape laughing about her own upcoming murder. Amanda fell in love with VOA. It helped that there were enough newsrooms at VOA that she was able to overcome her unfailing ability to get lost, even in familiar places. We live a block from DuPont Circle, and Amanda has frequently turned the wrong way when walking out the door to go to DuPont Circle. But no matter how many wrong turns she took within the building, she wound up in a newsroom. And in any newsroom, she always felt at home. I am a somewhat unusual figure tonight. This award was given out for the first time in 1973. And I'm pretty sure I knew, at least on a handshake basis, every winner but one in the history of this award. I worked as a colleague at the Washington Post with 15 previous winners. Tonight, you have picked not just another worthy winner, but a great one. And thank you, Allison and others at the Press Club. When Amanda was appointed the director of VOA, she made a speech, and I'll conclude by reading a couple of sentences from it. Quote, "We are the luckiest journalists in the world, and nobody knows that better than VOA. We live protected by American values, but we can all name countries that once had a free press and do not now. Instead, they are being threatened by ruling elites. We look at the almost impossible conditions our colleagues in other countries face as they struggle to tell the story, all the while facing harassment, interrogation, arrest, torture, and even death. We can still tell the stories that they are going to jail for, and we must also tell the story of our own country. We have to come through."
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Sandy, Allison, Barbara. I'd like to thank my children on both sides of the room, the rest of my family and friends. And I'd like to actually introduce a special guest here who has just been so great to come here, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, who has joined us. And I'd also like to point out that the person you were introduced to earlier, Una Lee, over there in the corner of the room, is the author of that video. But you know, we journalists can be a cynical lot. We spend our lives rooting around in the dark sides of things, exposing wrongdoing, cutting through spin, and bringing bad guys to heel. I know one editor years ago whose staff privately claimed that her motto was, "Everything sucks." Another scorned the people who were paid enormous sums to tell us that car sales were going up when they were actually going down, and that car prices were going down when they were actually going up. And he called them, and I apologize to all the fine, ethical PR people in the room, he called them lying, cheating sacks of manure. I know one reporter who covered financial crime so thoroughly that the editor said his ideal story would read, "The world is full of bad people. Here are their names." But we're also powerfully driven by idealism. And that's what this award is about, after all. Just look at the names of those who've won it in the past. I mean, Walter Cronkite, Jim Lehrer, Gwen Ifill. Men and women of our generation grew up in Vietnam's shadow. We saw class fighting class as cops and students clashed. Blacks fighting whites, whites fighting blacks. Whole cities burned to the ground. Our country's National Guard turned against our own citizens. Our government riven with corruption and brought to its knees by lies, suspicion, and malice. A pointless war that cost so many lives. So how many of us in this room were practically driven into this business by idealism? We were kids, what did we know? But we built our lives and careers on exposing wrongdoing. And by doing that, we played a big role in keeping our democracy astonishingly honest, astonishingly free, and astonishingly dedicated to the concept that government should not be corrupt. The companies should make things that do what they say they do and not hurt people. That businessmen and women and the government officials in whom we place our trust should be held to account. That we are a country and a people ruled by laws and principles. So now, at a time that seems almost overwhelmed by cynicism and despair, I find myself wanting more and more to burrow back into my past, to our shared past, to recover these old values. to unearth the childish, naive, impossible, even ridiculous idealism that drove us into this business in the first place. Because you see, these days I find myself at an extraordinary place. Here at a job I never expected to hold, at an organization I had almost forgotten existed, doing work that I didn't know needed to be done. Yet today I feel a little bit like George Bailey, because every day I get to see something I wouldn't normally have ever been able to see. I can see what our country would be like and what the world would be like if we didn't have the First Amendment, if we didn't have the Fourth Estate, if we didn't have you, my friends, all of you out there in the audience, and all of our counterparts all across the country. The world that I see from this perch is a world that is less fair, less caring of its citizens' rights, often brutally so. In our country, we rightly care about the gap between rich and poor. Yet in a world without a free press, there is outright cruelty as despots seize a country's assets as their own. And just think what it is like to live in a world where the press isn't just messy, unruly, and increasingly polarized. Think of a world where you can believe nothing. Nothing of what you read, hear, see in your country's media. Where every word is carefully calibrated to make you believe that up is down, right is left, bad is good, good is bad, and as they say, resistance is futile. How do I know? Because a world without free press is where my colleagues and I here at VOA live every day. You know those lists that Freedom House publish every year of unfree countries? We'll count up roughly 50 or 60 from the bottom, and there you have it, our audience. China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, North Korea. Now I know that some of you secretly have doubts about VOA. I know because I've heard them from you myself. And, why wouldn't you? I mean, after all, we journalists can be cynical. And Lord knows there's little in this town these days to suggest we ought to be less so. Yet facing down such skepticism is why I have a little mantra I use when I meet new people. Hi there, I say. I work for VOA. Yes, we still exist. No, we don't wear felt hats and only broadcast by shortwave anymore. And no, we don't do propaganda. And it's true, we don't do propaganda. And God willing, we never will. Here's what we do. We broadcast all around the world the uncensored version of speeches, the unheard views of opposition parties, the stories of disappeared teachers, politicians, journalists, sometimes whole populations. We also show the world America in all its, yes, greatness, and also its flaws and faults. We are as independent as all of you are, and again, God willing, we'll stay that way. As we say, we broadcast the First Amendment. We do news, current events, talk shows, women's programs, health programs, tech programs, in Chinese, Bambara, Russian, Farsi, Lingala, Hausa, Ukrainian, Tibetan, and 39 other languages, many of which I bet you've never even heard of, because I know I hadn't. In a huge part of the world, a bigger part than we can all bear to imagine, we are the free press. And not just that, we are the very idea that a free press can exist. For a free press is nothing more than an idea. Every day here at VOA, we ask people to put aside their fears and prejudices and do the best they can to honestly broadcast both the official line of dictatorships and that of those who oppose it. We ask them to report fairly about people who may have been their family's enemies for years, like asking journalists from Myanmar to ignore the anger and taunts from their family and friends back home and give the Rohingya a fair shake, or to brave government displeasure all around the world by writing dispassionately about the opposition. We ask them to do this even when it means a mysterious car parked outside their homes in China, or when they're hit by rubber bullets in Hong Kong, when even getting food and water is a hassle, as it is in Venezuela, even when they're pushed, shoved, detained, arrested, as our Tibetan reporters were last week in India, even when a car bomb narrowly misses them in the Kurdish area of Syria. And yes, sometimes, as in Somalia, even when it doesn't. This evening is all about celebrating idealistic, courageous journalism, but for me, there was no courage at all. It was all privilege. It was a privilege for me to be able to spend my entire life squarely within the values I know we all cherish. And the biggest privilege of all, it wasn't a privilege, it was a right. So we who have had that privilege of living our values owe it to those who come next to help ensure that they can too. And that means not just here in the US, but all over the world. And I'm asking you here to celebrate courageous journalism by protecting those who do this hard work right here in our own backyard. Take your colleagues here at VOA under your wing. The forces that threaten the free press, both abroad and at home, threaten them too. And if people continue to believe that VOA is already just spouting propaganda, then no one will be there to care if someday it is forced to do so. Please pay attention, not just for them, for you, and for all of us. Thank you.
It's hard to follow up those really incredibly inspiring and moving words. So I just want to say, first of all, congratulations and thank you, Amanda. I've had the privilege of sitting next to Amanda tonight with my new job at AP and have been whispering in her ear and asking advice. So hopefully tomorrow when I go back to work, I'll be wiser. One of the benefits of being the National Press Club's fourth estate winner is that you now get a lifetime membership to the National Press Club. So we present you with your card and hope to bring you back here often to share your knowledge and wisdom with all of us here at the club. And I want to congratulate all of tonight's award recipients. And before we retire to the Holman Lounge, where you can have more cocktails if you want, because we're all journalists here in the room. I want to thank our sponsors for their generosity and all of you who gave tonight. We have raised over $154,000 this evening. And I just want to remind you, as Amanda said, a lot of that money goes to our work in promoting press freedom in the United States and around the world. So I thank you all. This evening's event wouldn't be possible without the hard work of some very special people. In particular, I want to thank the National Press Club staff and the Institute staff the National Press Club's Executive Director, Bill McCarran, who made this evening a priority event every year and tonight. Julie Moose, the Executive Director of the Press Clubs Institute. And thank you all for your commitment to journalism and press freedom, and I invite you all next door for a nightcap. Thank you.